And panelists are friends of Foresight. It is my pleasure to welcome you all to this Foresight Friday on Futures Literacy and Imagining Africa's Futures. My name is Jaana Tapanainen-Thies. I'm from the Strategy Department from the Prime Minister's Office. These Foresight Fridays are part of our National Foresight Network events, and we are delighted to have you here. We're also delighted to have Permanent State Secretary Matti Antonen from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Finland, who was able to join us today from his busy schedule. In the globalized world, the Foreign Ministry is needed to promote Finland and Finnish players and actors across the globe, but we also need the Ministry of Foreign Affairs to bring the global trends to Finland. Please welcome Mr. Antonen.
Good morning, everybody, and very nice to be here. Last week, we gathered in this room to greet our new government, and they tried to explain to us civil servants what are the plans for the next 4 years. I don't know if that's future thinking, but anyway, that what we thought that those ideas sounded, at least at this stage, quite fine, and let's see, can we make them also the real future. Gathering together in the context of Foresight Friday it is in itself a statement. It implies that we see meaningfulness in thinking, debating, and shaping our futures. Such openness for future goes against one global political trend, that of resistance to change. Perhaps unavoidable uncertainty is still too poorly branded opportunity. Next Monday, we have 19th of August. I was a young diplomat and I was serving in Moscow the previous week, and if I would have done a prediction or a kind of idea about the Soviet Union next years, I would have probably been quite wrong. On Monday, 19th, they had the coup, and then the rest is history, and we don't have the Soviet Union anymore. So, the world can really change a lot, and in addition, it changes every single day. And seeing trend changes, seeing that is very difficult. Usually we see the trend change then 5-10 years later, when we can all agree that, okay, then 5 years ago it changed, but then when we are there at the actual time when the change takes place, it's very difficult to see. On Finland, I'm proud of our reputation in foresight and futures work. This expands from the university level to the Parliamentary Futures Committee and broad civil society and business. In the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, as part of the government-wide efforts, we have contributed our fair share to feed into this work. Currently, we are in a process of expanding futures thinking through our embassies in different continents. Next week, our ambassadors will enjoy one morning of futures work as part of the annual conference schedule. I don't know how they will manage, but I'll try. I think they will do fine. But this is something which is very much in our thinking, that we have to install this idea of really trying to look into the future, trying to find alternatives. Of course, it implies also that you have to be willing to make mistakes. I mean, if you want to see the future as clearly as today or the present, it is very difficult, and you have to accept that a lot of mistakes will be done. Not everything can be seen very clearly, but if you don't try to do that, you will be doing it less well. So, in a nutshell, from the foreign policy perspective, there cannot be foreign policy literacy with some kind of future literacy orientation. There is no contradiction of being pragmatic and result-orientated as well as future-orientated at the same time. Foreign policy is very much about the continuity, as you know. Predictability is a virtue for us, like for most others too. Still, thinking of alternative global or local futures helps to be proactive and to adapt to rapidly changing circumstances. One should always be thinking 1 or 2 steps ahead. For example, we could already be thinking of alternatives of Finland's role and niche if an era of is reached where climate change, adaptation and mitigations measures work sufficiently. When we think of this climate change, I think very often we see nightmares of the situation that the mitigation work does not bring fruit, and then something bad or undesirable happens. But we should be also prepared for the future when we will succeed in mitigating climate change, because that will imply change as well. And in many ways that will imply changes which are even more profound than those changes which are coming from the not doing things. Because that will imply that we have a totally different kind of energy system, which is not based on the fossil fuels burning of something. And that will then have quite real implications in many parts of the world, especially in those places which are totally dependent on production and export of fossil fuels, for example. So thinking about kind of also desirable outcomes is useful because, that can bring as much disruption as can be those kind of undesirable outcomes. Overall, Finnish foreign policy and foreign policy as such is more and more becoming interconnected with so-called domestic policies. Examples are multiple: migration, climate, security, rule of law. Therefore, scientists, educationalists, civil society actors, civil servants, students, all and much more are needed to make future thinking comprehensive. Today's Foresight Friday will focus on future literacy skills. Here I refer to the concept of future literacy as a capability and to the pioneering work UNESCO has done. What makes this occasion particularly inspiring is the combination of future literacy and Africa. Putting it bluntly, if we are not interested in the future, or rather the multiple futures of the youthful African continent, we are not interested in our future either. The making and shaping of the future is out there in Africa, and it's there now. Megatrends affecting Africa, like climate change, demographic change, urbanization, migration, technological change, and democracy trends, were this week discussed in our ministry. Of course, this is an example of the work needed to step up our Africa policy as stated in our new government program. There is an urge for more comprehensive relationship with Africa and with Finland and Africa and with the European Union and Africa. One question would be if and how Finnish type of anticipatory governance and future literacy skills could be usefully combined with our Africa policy. The work towards achieving the Sustainable Development Goals increasingly benefit from building local future literacy skills. Foresight for development is another related field. How to facilitate and contribute through future literacy skills and foresight to make development cooperation fit for the future. I'm sure you will elaborate extensively on all this and much more, and I wish you a very fruitful exchanges of future literacy work here in Säätytalo today. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. The first presentation will be from Dr. Riel Miller, Head of Futures Literacy at UNESCO. He is a pioneering professional in so many ways. He has been pioneering advances in the theory and practice of using the future as a means to improve management and public policy, with a focus in transforming leadership. He is a pioneer of futures literacy and the discipline of anticipation. His unflagging ambition is to find ways to put the richness of complex emergence at the service of humanity's capacity to be free. Please welcome Dr. Riel Miller.
That's the wrong presentation. It's okay.
It's all in there.
That's that one.
This one.
No, that's Alina's.
Then it's this one.
This one. That's the one.
Sorry.
No problem. Great. Okay. Thank you very much, Minister of State, colleagues, friends. It's a great privilege to be here. It's always been very rewarding and inspiring to come to Finland to talk about futures thinking. I've been doing it for many years now, and so I greatly appreciate this moment. It reflects, I think, a lot of investments and efforts from many different directions and places in the world, but also it reflects, as the minister said, the time, the moment we're living in today. But I want to start with a little story, quite a happy and interesting story that just was sparked by what was said just before we started the session about electrification. In 1978, I met a then young fellow whose name was Kevule Kamara, who was from Sierra Leone, from a small village in the hills in Sierra Leone, Dankawali. That was 1978. So let's fast forward. Last year in Dankawali, they installed solar energy in the village. This is a village which had no road and had no electricity. But last year, they installed for the first time solar energy to electrify the village. And this meant that in part they could take a different approach to their forest. And we know how important forests are. In Finland, people understand forestry, I think, very well. I'm Canadian, I understand forestry as well. But with electrification in their village, they could begin to transform, not necessarily in ways that we might expect, because they actually moved to conserve, forestry conservation, and a way of approaching resources that are in keeping with our times, but also with their aspirations. Now, why do I mention the electrification in Dankawali in Sierra Leone? It's because we did futures literacy in Dankawali for the last 10 years. We have worked together to create a sense that people can have their own idea of the future, that they can source their images of tomorrow from their own history and their own context. I'll relate another little story. We were in Kigali, in Rwanda, thinking about the future of innovation in Africa. I had 110 young university students to think about the future of Rwanda. And given the opportunity to think about the future initially, it was natural and not unexpected that the powerful, seductive images of the future that can be seen in a Hollywood movie Black Panther, that show Wakanda, an ideal city, a techno-egalitarian utopia, would be one of the first images of the future to come to mind. And here were 110 20-year-olds. When asked to think about the future, the images they used were, of course, the images that are in popular culture, that are easily accessible, that are seductive in ways which a brilliant utopia can be. And we know that humanity has been seduced by utopias in the past, oftentimes with very, very negative consequences. And when we finished the session, I asked a couple of them, how did it make you feel to imagine Rwanda, Wakanda, as a techno-utopia? And they said, it made us feel desperate. It filled us with despair because we think we'll never make it. But worse than that, in a sense, is that it's not their future. It's what we call in the futures field used futures. They're futures that have been used by somebody else. Now, I use these two examples, the empowerment in Dankawali, as people think about the future in their own community, in their own terms, and the experience in a place like Kigali where we ask people, as we so often do, to think about the future. And what they first come up with in their minds is powerful, is present, but in fact can be very negative, not that useful, not that constructive. And I raise these two examples because I think it's indicative of the kind of capability, competency-based approach that futures literacy is all about. In other words, if you're, let's talk about, a peasant, a rural farmer. It's true there was a time when you would say, well, why do you need to learn to read? You're just doing what your mother or your father did. You're repeating it. You're learning by doing. You live in a society that's quite stable. You don't need to be able to read and write. Who needs these fancy tools? Who needs access to these strange ideas from outside? Not necessary. But of course, if you move from the countryside into the city, if you move from being in a rural to an urban, if you move from a farming to an industrial society, you need to be able to read. You need to be able to write. You can't function without it. And in today's world, we cannot function simply using somebody else's future. We have to be able to source the future. We have to be able to invent hope. We have to be able to understand our fears on the basis of our own history, our own context. And this means that we have to sharpen, improve, exercise this fundamentally powerful human capability, which is the ability to imagine. The future can only be imagined. It's not there to touch. There's no evidence that you can have of the future. It's not here yet. So the question becomes, how do we exercise? How do we structure? How do we become capable of using our imagination more effectively? And that's true here in Finland, and it's true in Africa. So the work that's being done at UNESCO as an organization that is dedicated to the sources and practices of human knowledge. Education, science, culture are all forms of human knowledge. UNESCO is about how we use humanity's capacity to create knowledge. The knowledge that we're talking about with futures literacy is one related to anticipation. So I'm, of course, tempted, as somebody who's trying to kind of construct collaboratively, build something together, raise a barn, to talk about the deep foundations that underpins this work. I hope you can see its urgency, its importance, being able to understand how we use the future better. Now, let me say it again, it's deeply connected to the way in which we construct our hopes and our fears. And hope and fear, expectations, are not just some kind of superficial aspect of everyday life. They're very profoundly connected to our motivations and to our actions. So this is not something that's just theoretical and removed. Hopes and fears are in the practice of daily life. And the way they're constructed, the way they emerge, are not something that's fixed. We don't have to be afraid of falling off the side of the earth today, because we don't believe anymore that the earth is flat. So our fears change with the way we understand the world. And futures literacy is precisely about being able to change in everyday life the way we construct our hopes and our fears, the way we're motivated, how we are able to understand sometimes the other, the foreign, the strange, the alien, because we have a framework which allows us to understand why we fear and to overcome our fears. So this is about peace, this is about investment, this is about, in many ways, anxiety, happiness, feeling at ease with the world around you. Pardon me. But having said that, and created the context for what this is all about, I'm just going to take you into a little bit of a deeper dive, which is my predilection kind of thing, and to point out what this means in the underpinnings, that there is a very sort of solid foundation for doing this work. And by a solid foundation, I mean both the theory and the practice. And I'm going to take you quickly through both aspects of that. And one of the other things to point out is that here in Finland, there's a strong history and a strong resource, a real, fun, practical resource in both the theory and practice, both the research and the application of futures thinking. One other kind of background piece, though. When a shift takes place in the way we think about things, it's associated with many factors. It's not just one thing that all of a sudden changes the way people think about the world. There's a confluence of factors. One of the things that's happening in the futures field is a shift from a strong and persistent preoccupation with the tools, the how-to, the epistemology. And I'm an economist. I've worked at the OECD, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. Models, forecasting, extrapolation, quantitative analysis are very important and effective tools for imagining the future. A forecast of the weather or the economy is an imaginary projection. It's a way of structuring our imagination, as much as a Hollywood scenario is a way of imagining the future. Modeling and extrapolation is a way of imagining the future. And for many reasons, we've been very preoccupied with the tools, the hammer, the screwdriver. And in many ways, because of the power of forecasting, in terms of satisfying the itch, and it's more than an itch, it's kind of like a deep desire to know the future. Forecasting has taken a privileged position in the late 20th century in the way we structure our imagination about the future. The deficiencies of forecasting led to quite a bit of interest in an alternative, which became foresight and scenarios and efforts to see multiple futures. But again, it was a tool. It was a question of how can we create many different images of the future. Now, these tools are essential, and we still use them. But the basic message, in some senses, of futures literacy is that we need to understand why we're using one particular tool rather than another, and also to understand that we can diversify our tools, and that diversification depends primarily on why we're using the future. What's the purpose? Why am I using a hammer and not a screwdriver? Why am I trying to create furniture or build a house? Maybe I should be doing something else. In other words, to understand why I'm using the future. So this shift from preoccupation in the futures field with tools and the output of tools, which have been scenarios, which have been forecasts, to a broader-based approach, which diversifies the way we use the future, is really the key aspect of futures literacy. But this diversification is contingent upon, depends upon, having sufficient underlying theories of what is anticipation. How do we anticipate? What are the processes? I believe, but it's a speculative hypothesis, a bet, that we are at a turning point. We are at an inflection point. That in retrospect, which of course we can't do, the current moment will be one where we see that futures thinking changed. The way the future entered into all of our reflection, whether it's biology, chemistry, physics, economics, sociology, psychology, the way it entered into public policy, the way it entered into political discourse, that we are at a turning point in the way humanity introduces the future into everything we do. Now, at the beginning, when that kind of an inflection point happens, it's not obvious. Our language, our discourse, our ideas have not taken into account. They haven't adapted to this change. So it's not necessarily an obvious transition, and the way to make the transition is not a given. The way to move forward is to experiment, to test, to conduct research, but to do so in a rigorous, applied, practical way where we can test ideas, where we can run experiments, and we can test our theories and our hypotheses. So that's what the Futures Literacy Project at Unesco has been doing, and just to give you an example of, let's see. Will this move forward? Aha, there we go. But to just give you an example, and this is not meant to be something we'll go into in depth, but the point is that when you begin to think about the future in different ways, it opens up a whole series of alternative perspectives. And the critical thing here, at first, is the way in which perception is influenced by the future. And I'm not talking about action as something I'm going to make a choice. If I tell you that the future is a fork in the road, right? You can go uphill or downhill. You can go right or you can go left. The first thing you have to do is you have to see the fork in the road, right? You can't make the choice to go right or to go left if you don't see the fork. So first and foremost, in that sense, the future is about seeing the world around us. That's before you decide which way to go. Now, sometimes people say, well, look, it's obvious. This road goes right off a cliff, and I can see that. So I'm not going to take that road because it goes right off the cliff. But again, it's the future. How do you know that it's really a cliff? Maybe it's a shortcut. Maybe it's a whole new world. Because the future doesn't exist, you don't know. And so the question becomes perpetually, how is our imagination influencing our perception of the present? If the only way that I see security is to stay a peasant on a farm, I'm not going to be very happy about moving out to the city where things are going to be very uncertain. But I might do it because I have no choice. But that's because I feel like I have no choice. Because my hopes and my expectations are that the only way to move ahead is to get away from the farm. All of these things are created by our imagination. And so if we look at the transformation from the 19th century state and the public policy challenges of the 19th century and the 20th century to some of the challenges which are on the right here and now, the question becomes, how do we relate to those from the point of view of our understanding of the future? I want to introduce this because I think it's really a fundamental component of the change that's taking place. And I apologize for all the text. But our very understanding of the world changes the conditions of a changing world. And so do our wishes, our preferences, our motivations, our hopes, our dreams, our fantasies, our hypotheses, our theories. All of this amounts to the fact that determinism is simply mistaken. All of its traditional arguments have withered away, and indeterminism and free will have become part of the physical and biological sciences. Now, I'm saying that in a context where we're talking about government and we're talking about public policy, which is not the physical sciences. But think about it. Public policy, we want to influence the future. But the future is not like billiard balls. It's not like, I'm going to knock this ball, then it'll knock that ball, then it'll knock this one, and then everything will be fine. This is a mistaken way of thinking about complex emergence. And so the question becomes, if we're not going to imagine a world where determinism reigns, where in effect we can play God, because the power of our determinism is so strong that we can control the future, we can create the future, we can colonize tomorrow with today's ideas. But if we abandon that pretension, if we take a more humble perspective, what can we do? I use this image in the context of climate change, and yesterday in Edinburgh, where I was in Scotland, the taxi driver talked to us about climate change and said to us in the car as we were going to the airport, he said, I have seen this summer that climate change is something that's happening now. He has this fellow had 6 grandchildren, and he says, for my grandchildren, climate change is going to be very important. Because this summer, I saw things in the climate that I had never seen before in my entire life. I believe climate change is happening. But one of the issues, and the minister's already made reference to this, is that if we're in those boats, see those boats there? If you're the captain of the boat, you imagine yourself the captain of the boat, and you say, well, how can I turn the boat? What's my policy instrument for turning the boat? And maybe if you're the scientist or the economist or the policy advisor, you say, how long will it take before I get to the edge? How much time will it take before we go off the edge? And the dragon gets us, and we fall off the edge of the earth. Well, those are very important preoccupations, of course, if you're the captain of the boat and if you're the scientist on the boat and you say, how long will it take? But of course, as we know, there is no edge. This is a completely false image of the world. Perception is driving our science and our policy, but from a paradigm, from a perspective on the world, which is just wrong. So one of the questions that we have with respect to climate change is the very basic relationship that we have to the world around us, the relationship of humans in this cosmos, in this universe, our connection, our reflexive and entangled connection to each other, the way in which reality emerges. Not an objectivist reality, we exist and reality exists, but we co-create it all the time. What does this mean for changing the way we think about the world around us. So these are the changing conditions of change, and it's about how to get better at sensing and making sense of complexity. Uncertainty is not a liability, it is an asset. And here we're talking about transforming human agency. That's what futures literacy is about. Now, futures literacy is basically something that people, say, what? What's that? What do you mean? And it's normal that people should ask that question because they're not, haven't encountered it. You haven't been asked to understand and explain how you think about the future. In other words, there are many people in this room, I've done it hundreds and hundreds of times. What do you think of the future? And people go, very interesting, because the future, I care about the future. The future matters. But the image that I invent of the future, what's it based on? How do I come up with that? How do I create that image? How do I use my imagination? So futures literacy is about trying to understand the different ways in which anticipation functions. And we've been using a process to make the invisible visible, the why, what, and how of the imaginary future. And at Unesco, this is now a bit out of date, but we've been going all around the world asking people to think about the future and to reveal their anticipatory assumptions and to understand their anticipatory systems. And we've been doing it in many different contexts with many different subjects, many different people, because everybody uses the future. The future is something that pretty much everybody relates to. Anticipation is a very basic characteristic of human existence, and in fact of most living things, of all living things. We've been building up a global futures literacy network, and this network consists of anticipatory systems conferences. There's going to be a conference in Oslo coming up in October. We've been building up futures literacy centers, and Finland, one of the first to establish a Unesco chair in future studies with Markku Valenius at the Finland Futures Research Center and at the University of Turku. We have others now in the Netherlands, Tunisia, Uruguay, and we have many under development in Belgium, in Switzerland, in France, Morocco, around the world. This is moving forward. We had the first meeting just, 6 weeks ago in Trento, in Italy, of the UNESCO chairs in anticipatory systems. And these UNESCO chairs are helping to establish the research agenda, but they're also helping to establish the experimental agenda, meaning the processes, the applied experimental methods that we're using on the ground to develop the capability that is futures literacy. There's an Imagining Africa's Futures project, which is prototyping. We're working with the United Arab Emirates to experiment with the way in which public policy and students in the university can become more futures literate and use that futures literacy in their work. And we're trying to design, that's one of the reasons to be here, working with colleagues from Finland to develop and apply futures literacy in many different contexts, including climate change and the question of how the future is integrated into climate change. Because one of the most powerful, and I think it's pretty self-evident, climate change today is based on forecasting, models that forecast the future of the climate. And they're very convincing, they're very powerful images of the future. And they're motivating people to talk about climate extinction, an emergency. But there's also many other aspects of the future that need to be integrated into that imaginary future. And the question becomes how to do that. And so we've been thinking about climate change, not just as adaptation, not just as mitigation, but also as transformation. And the question becomes, how do you think about transformation? Transformation is one way of imagining the future. So these are all things that we've been working on. Many of you know that there's a book available for free download, which covers these issues, provides a theoretical framework. I'm not going to go into it in detail, but it's about diversifying the uses of the future. Diversifying the uses of the future doesn't say that one way of using the future is better than another. It says that we need to understand the many different ways of imagining the future. So it wasn't that long ago that the minister from Malaysia asked me, so are you going to tell my future like a crystal ball, like a card reader, like a tea leaf reader? And I said, well, no, I'm not going to use a crystal ball. But that doesn't mean a crystal ball is something to be thrown away. In other words, there are contexts where the way in which we provoke our imagination, the way in which we cultivate our imagination, there are many different contexts and ways and reasons for doing that. And it's not, how can I put it, if you want to change your idea of the future, one of the easy ways to do that, maybe not so easy to actually achieve, but is to fall in love. When you fall in love, all of a sudden your future has changed because you imagine your future with that other person. But what does that do? That changes your present because all of a sudden you start doing many different things in the present. If you go to a card reader and they say to you, you have my permission because the cards say so, to fall in love. Maybe that's the confidence you need to imagine your future. And the point that I'm making is that being able to stimulate our imaginations, being able to alter our imagination, being able to break out of our existing framework of imagining the future, it can happen through a crystal ball. But it can also happen in the more conventional way today, the more orthodox way, through forecasts and through scenarios and through multiple possible futures. Extrapolating in various and different ways, linear, non-linear, the future. So you have the future is many, not one, but it's probable, preferable. And these are the futures that we project on the basis of what we know. And then there's another, which is an area where we're much less experienced, which has to do with the open future. A future where we stand back and we wait because we don't know until things happen what's possible and imaginable. And this is a much more experimentalist, a much more kind of improvisational and spontaneous future. And I put this image of the murmuration up because it illustrates the spontaneity, the improvisational nature of what they're doing. The birds are following a very simple algorithm, and the birds have very specific capabilities that make it possible for them to be spontaneous and improvise, like in the murmuration. And so one of the questions then becomes, how do you create the conditions? How do you create the ability for improvisation and imagination? The birds, of course, had no leader, no designer, no policy that said, do it this way. The birds were able to do this through an evolutionary process. Humans, perhaps, can help set the conditions for jazz, for improvisation. We can create the capabilities that allow us to be more spontaneous and more improvisational. This framework is meant to help us to see those different ways of using the future and to be able to design processes that help us understand what kind of future we're imagining. And when I say what kind of future, I'm trying to make an ontological distinction. There are different kinds of futures. And for different kinds of futures, you use different tools. And you have different expectations. Why you think about the future is different. Now, obviously, I'm not going to go into the details of this chart. It's in the book, and you can, of course, look at it in the book. Again, free to download. But one of the ways that we're illustrating the effectiveness of this framework, the utility of this framework, that we're testing the framework to see if it makes sense, if it's reflected by what goes on in the world around us, is by running futures literacy laboratories. Now, futures literacy laboratories are a tool. They're one specific method. They are not futures literacy. They're one way of exposing, revealing futures systems, anticipatory approaches, anticipatory assumptions. And so they're one way of researching anticipation, and they're one way of building futures literacy, the capability to use the future. So futures literacy laboratories are action learning, learning by doing. They're action research. They're collective intelligence knowledge creation. They expand the menu, sensing and making sense of the richness of the present. They help you to become capable of designing processes. Now, this is what we did in Dankawali. This is what we did in Rio. This is what we did in South Africa. We did these processes, not because that is the future, but because that's a way of building capability, creating sense-making, conducting research, and becoming more able to understand the anticipatory systems that structure our thinking. It's based on a very straightforward and fundamental aspect of the way humans function, which is the Dewey learning cycle. This is from Ilka, who's sitting in the audience, Ilka Toomey, who has been working extensively. We kind of parallel and together, weaving all this stuff as we go along. But the learning cycle is a fundamental aspect of getting people to understand their anticipatory assumptions. Why is that? It's because the future is something that's really visceral. It really matters. And so if you begin to play with the way people think about the future, it needs to be something that they can feel, integrate, make sense of, not just something that disempowers from the point of view of saying, your future's illiterate, but from the point of view of saying, if you have not been thinking about your anticipatory systems and anticipatory assumptions, here's how you can do that. And here's how you can become more able, more capable, more futures literate. No labs are microscopes of the 21st century. They use narrative capacity, collective intelligence, and the capacity to reframe. They have a very basic structure and design, so they're easy to design. People can do it themselves. It's tacit to explicit. It's a process of learning by reframing, and it allows you to ask new questions. So these are the futures literacy labs that UNESCO has been prototyping and working around the world on. There are many people in the room who've worked with me on these various labs. There's a prototype that we're developing. We're testing it primarily for the time being in Africa, where we're going through the initiation, the co-design, the preparation, the implementation, and the follow-through. This offers us a chance to transform human agency and to change this opposition with complexity. Futures illiteracy generates many things that are very difficult for us to deal with. Fear of uncertainty, a bias to seeking path dependency. What does that mean? If you build a pyramid, like the pyramids in Egypt, well, it lasts for 5,000 years. It's very predictable. It's a very sure way of thinking about the future, but it locks us in. The fetishism of immortality, which is all around us. Things should last forever. But in fact, if things last forever, well, maybe the dinosaurs would still be here and we wouldn't. Things die and things are born. That's an important part of the way in which change takes place in the world around us. The preoccupation with endogenous continuous improvement. Very often we're just trying to improve existing systems, to preserve them, in the hope that they'll last forever, which they don't. And a false sense of the temporality of change. Futures literacy kind of pushes people to say, well, I'll think about the future in an open way, but only in 50 years, or only in 30 years. Whereas we know that something could happen tomorrow that would open up all sorts of new possibilities and changes. Complex emergent systems have tipping points. They have confluences, they have surprises. And if we want to think about the future, it's not just to be ready for those surprises in the sense of some sort of psychological robustness, but it's also to be able to take advantage of those surprises, to be able to see that the transformation offers entirely new ways of thinking. If I had said the word Google 20 years ago here, everybody would look at me and say, Google? What's that? Today, if I say Google, everybody knows. So we can begin to think about the future and use the future to understand the inside in, the outside in, the inside out, and the outside out. In other words, very often, futurists, people like myself, are invited to say, well, how can I think outside the box? Well, first of all, you have to decide what is the box. You have to be able to define the box. And one of the key things that the future allows us to do is to identify your assumptions. In other words, to identify your box. And then you can say, well, I want to think about it inside the box, which is fine, but also outside the box. And for policymakers, people who are thinking about government, but also when we try to think about development, if we're going to try and think outside the box, and everybody says, well, look, more or less, the old development model is finished. We can't continue on the old development model. We can't continue with the old ways of thinking about energy. And by the way, where are jobs going to come from when robots are doing all these things? And then you say, well, time to think outside the box. But how? What is your box? So for me, this is a kind of dual paradigm perspective. This is the famous Maoist image of the peasant and the worker, two paradigms that I've already made reference to. But in terms of reframing human agency, it means anticipation for the future, what we prepare for, what we plan for, and anticipation for emergence, spontaneity, improvisation, sense-making, inventing the unknowable. And it's a way to begin to be more effective at distinguishing search from choice. Defining the menu is not the same as choosing what's on the menu. Those are two different things. They're both important. But if we think that the search is the choice, then we actually reduce our capacity to do both. So it takes us away from path dependency and from determining the future as if it was given. The value added of futures literacy is that it allows us to embrace science's generality with managerialism, and science of specificity with experimentalism. My last slide. This is an image very often of how people think about leadership and change. They want us to be able to go from one place to another, from A to B, across the precipice, across the chasm, and they want somebody to take us there. Show me the strong leader that will make something great again. Follow me. But when you look at this image, do you think that it makes a lot of sense? Is that something you want to do? Would you like to get on that tightrope? I don't think so. In other words, how we anticipate matters. It changes the present. Thank you.
We have the possibility to pose some questions to Riel, and I wonder if some of you would have a question on their mind that they'd like to pose now.
Hi, Amos Taylor. This is really interesting, and I like your open way of exploring the future's literacy. Can you also kind of think that, how it already has changed the future's literacy from how, as you're observing, because you're in practice working with it, and can you kind of anticipate some direction where future's literacy could be going?
Thank you. Very, very crucial set of questions there. Very briefly, I don't think that futures literacy and the things that I've been talking about in terms of anticipation are because I'm particularly, or anybody else here in the audience is particularly, a genius or clairvoyant. Not at all. I think it's because it's in the air. This is the time. The way in which people, we have to use the future. It's related to hope and fear. About, I'd say 15 years ago, I started to feel very overwhelmingly what Karl Popper called poverty of the imagination. And poverty of the imagination leads to war. And that poverty, I felt, could be addressed, not by throwing resources at it, but by changing capabilities. And so I think that all around the world, at very many different levels, wherever people are, the inadequacy, the poverty of their imaginations, which relates to their hopes and their fears, is something that people are struggling with. And so that struggle is underway. And what this is about understanding it better and trying to be more effective. And so my hope is, it's not a prediction, but my hope is, and the reason that I think why I do this work, is because by improving that capability, we can begin to overcome poverty of the imagination.
Thank you, Riel. Let's give it to Riel one more time. I'm very happy to be able to welcome our guest from Namibia, Dean Professor Dr. Alina Segobie. She is the Dean of Faculty of Human Sciences at the Namibia University of Science and Technology. She holds an honorary professorship at the Thabo Mbeki African Leadership Institute, the University of South Africa, and is a research scholar at the African Futures Institute and the Institute of Economic Research and Innovation, Tshwane University of Technology in Pretoria, South Africa. She has been associate professor of archaeology for over 20 years. And she has extensive teaching, research, and consultancy experience in African studies, gender, and development. Please welcome Mrs. Alina Segobie.
Thank you very much. Good morning. It is my great pleasure to be here. It is my very first time in Finland, and it is really a pleasure to be with this audience, in particular to be in the same room with Riel, with whom I've worked for some time, but I have not seen for quite a number of years, but share deeply and passionately this field. I am an archaeologist by training, surprise, but I've taken great interest in the future, precisely for the reasons or how Riel has articulated them. I should first thank, of course, Jana and her team, and particularly our first speaker, for laying the foundation for this very session. And I'm aware that it is a very important moment for me coming from Namibia, but also just representing Southern Africa and the continent at large. Perhaps by way of self-introduction, I can say that, as Riel said with the story, I would say probably 33 years ago, when my mother turned 60, she called us as her children, announced to us that she had a revelation or dream. And she had understood that her days more or less had been done on earth, and that she was going to be leaving us soon. So we, of course, were alarmed, but she told us in very gentle ways that we should not expect her to be around with us much longer. I was then still in college, and indeed was gripped by fear to think I'm going to be losing my mother. Surprise, surprise. At 93 years old, she's still around and celebrated her birthday last month and going very strong, and we can see she's going nowhere. Her sister is 100 years old since June. So my thoughts are that if I play my cards right, I'm made to be around for quite some time, which really gives me a big reason to think about and invest in the future, not just mine, but at a global level. In this presentation, I'll share with you a few points, and clearly my interest and context and I'd say intellectual work is around Africa. I'm a Pan-Africanist, and besides having learned about the African past and its diverse richness, I'm very interested in contemporary African issues, development issues, but also by extension then, of course, the future. And I think one of the things that I tend to look at is how Africa has been framed, and there are many narratives about the continent, starting from imagination of Africa in literature, the imagination of Africa in, for example, texts that did not know Africa, but framed Africa, and popular literature in the 19th century that tried to create an image of Africa that would attract young, I guess, naive Europeans to venture to Africa and live there. And of course, many did that. And then, of course, the imagination of Africa by Africans, ourselves. And then beyond that, to see how we can reimagine, indeed, using the technologies and tools that Riel spoke to, of Africa's futures. And then, of course, at a much more personal level, imagine how I, as an African intellectual, can play a role in building different kinds of futures that are informed by evidence, by research. And to do that, I'll go a little bit back to the past. I did say I'm an archaeologist. Oops, sorry. And take you to the Africa that you may be familiar with. And I'll just use 5 images that more or less speak to themselves, but are very, I'd say, intimately linked to what I will speak about. Many of you are familiar with the pyramids of Giza, and of course, all the pyramids in Egypt and Ethiopia and beyond. You're familiar with the deep, rich history of the Egyptian civilization. But many of you also know that Egyptology is not usually a study in African studies. It is usually studied as a discipline in the classics outside of Africa. Even today, many people will say, well, Egypt is not really in Africa. It's not African. People are not really African. So the question is, what is Africa to me, to you, to everybody? Then we go a little bit into the interior, and you go to Mali, to Djenné, which is, of course, a very interesting country, both in its past and its contemporary, and perhaps its future. And the mosque of Djenné, which is built almost totally with organic materials, mud and wood, and still stands today, speaking to the durability that Riel spoke to earlier, of the human capability to construct, but also to the ingenuity, the science of ability of people 1,000+ years ago to imagine, construct, and leave a legacy of something like Djenné. Of course, with it is a deep complexity of then what is Djenné? As a mosque, clearly it speaks to meeting of points, Arabic, religious, cultural institutions in the Sahel, and later on, of course, what has come to pass as the challenges of managing complexity of religious and cultural meeting points. Coming down south, closer to my home, Great Zimbabwe. Again, many of you may be familiar with the misreadings of Great Zimbabwe. oftentimes attributed in the literature to Phoenicians or some other exotic peoples, but not given its true identity as a civilization that was built by people, Bantu-speaking people of Southern Africa, who were part of farming pastoralist societies of the South. It still stands strong today, but gives us challenges in terms of heritage management because we don't know the science that built it, so attempts to reconstruct or to preserve Great Zimbabwe tend to be quite guesswork, if I could say that. But nonetheless, a very interesting testament to human capabilities and oftentimes highlighting the cultural and creative capabilities of peoples, even when we try to silence such stories. More to the present, of course, still in sub-Saharan Africa, as it's sometimes called, the Dogon cultures of Mali. Many of you may be familiar and reading more recent media of some of the violent conflicts that are happening in this part of the world. They are framed, if you read the literature, around the idea of Fulani headsmen slaughtering peoples, and oftentimes missing the extreme depth of complexity of human culture, human nature relations in a region such as this, where clearly the impact of climate and other environmental challenges have led to an extreme competition for scarce resources. But of interest to me, of course, has been the vibrancy of the cultures of the people of the Dogon. If some of you are familiar with Malian, contemporary Malian arts, you know the beautiful artwork, earthenware, and other kinds of material culture coming from this region. And my final slides, of course, being a woman, comes to somebody you may know and recognize. I always say I wonder what Nefertiti's Instagram account would look like today if she had one. Because the idea of beauty, and particularly of an African woman's beauty, is often not judged through Nefertiti because oftentimes she has been made and remade in the image that is not necessarily easy to recognize as African. So oftentimes when you think about the catwalk, the idea of classical beauty is often not of a woman like years gone by, Iman or Naomi Campbell or Alec Weck, but more of these kinds of features that oftentimes even begin to disguise what would have been what we'd call classical African features. So in many regards, the African past informs what I would consider our thinking in the present, and as has been said, our capacity to imagine the future. And my presentation will look very quickly at some of these issues and take you through what I see as some of the reasons why we do not want to get out of this comfort zone of thinking, and conclude by looking at what is possible in terms of areas of intervention, particularly in terms of Finland-Namibia partnerships that can emerge. Now, as I've said, the continent has been studied from many different lenses, but most importantly, as I think Ariel said, the context, the study of Africa in terms of future studies is quite new. We've seen emerging in the last 20, 30 years a more vibrant reading of Africa's futures, of prospective studies. And this was, of course, inspired by a project led by the UNDP, which resulted with the creation of the African Futures Project, and then, of course, the creation of the African Futures Institute, of which I am a scholar there. And more recently, the emergence of other new institutions in the region. In South Africa, of course, the Institute for Strategic Studies has been quite key in leading some of the continental-based future studies. But of course, key in these discourses has been concern with development, as has been said, a more economics-informed perspective, and also more recently, the peace and security nexus in terms of how these impact on or affect contemporary African citizenry and also their futures. So in the area of peace studies, we've seen a lot of interest in investing in post-conflict studies. But in my view, we need to expand this lens a little bit more to think outside of these traditional domains, to look especially at the field of higher education And as someone who comes from the background of education, this is why I'm interested in this field. There's also a need why we need to keep rethinking and reframing the idea of Africa, because otherwise then we get caught in what I would say is the paradox of the victim of Africa as the post-colony and the victim of Africa in the future as impoverished. So between those trajectories, it's important to think outside of the proverbial box and to think how can we imagine Africa not at its worst possible moment as was framed by Times in 2000 when what we call Afro-pessimistic perspective presented Africa as seemingly, I would say, a hopeless continent that is beyond. I mean, the presentation then of Africa as a continent riddled with problems, poverty, war, all other kinds of ills, robbed us of the imagination of Africa as a hopeful continent, which actually surprisingly came a short decade later, when the idea of Africa as a rich continent was projected in the Times again, surprise, surprise, of 2010, where the idea of Africa's emergence, of highlighting the 10-plus states of Africa, which were showing positive two-digit growth. So what really was informing these ambivalences? As I've said, part of it is partly how we've seen Africa presented through the literature. Now, all of us perhaps know of the idea of Africa as the cradle of humankind, evidence-based. As an archaeologist, clearly the idea of East Africa, the Rift African Valley, the Rift Valley, and then in Southern Africa, the cradle of humankind area, including the sites of Sterkfontein, where a number of paleontological finds have given evidence to the antiquity of human origins, and then human capabilities are there for us to see. But however, the idea of modern humans emerging out of Africa has been something that has been, particularly in the 19th century European science, difficult to wrap our heads around as archaeologists, anthropologists. And this perhaps has to do with how Africa was presented in historical writings in the 19th century. In this instance, the idea that places like Great Zimbabwe did belong to African creative capabilities and intellectual capabilities was denied, perhaps because at the time, the colonial moment, it was important to highlight African citizenry or African peoples as incapable to justify the colonial project. So in this regard, it is important that Africa's colonial past and the lens which were used to read that past are revisited, reinterrogated, and for us to note that these pasts in their multivocality are not passive, and despite the post-liberation moment that we live in, they are not behind us, they're not forgotten. They continue to inform the present. They continue to inform, for example, perception of self by young Africans. When I was teaching archaeology, and I've taught it for more than 20 years, many of my students refused, and I mean refused, to believe that they were in any way associated with or could be associated with the greatness of Egypt, of Great Zimbabwe. That question will always be, well, if our ancestors did all that, then why are we so dumb now? And I'd say, you're not dumb. Your current circumstances in terms of perhaps weakness, a weak moment, do not define your future. You may not be able to build or understand the science that built the pyramids or Great Zimbabwe, but doesn't mean you don't have the capacity to do something different in the future. I'm happy to say most of them I was able to influence them, and they've since gone on to do greater things. But it is difficult for people who do not believe they have a past worth knowing to imagine that they have a future worth living. So most people tend to think, why bother? And this is not helped by the fact that across the continent, we've also dealt with a lot of other issues. In this instance, the post-colony brought with it conflict, hunger, poverty, and now climate change challenges, leadership deficits. And these have, in many regards, made people believe in what I call the nowism. People live for the moment. The fight or flight mindset became our very existence. It's interesting that in development studies, we speak a lot about resilience or adaptability or adaptation of communities because people have learned to live in the new normal in flight mode. So internally displaced people can get up, pack up, and go to the next place of flight and set up camp, and children go to school tomorrow, and we make more babies, and things happen. You get a little shamba, you get on with it. And that is actually what, in many ways, robs the continent, particularly in, I would say, countries below the Sahel, perhaps actually across the entire continent, this capacity to be futures, I would say, hopeful, or futures passionate, because that has been taken away by the experiences of the present, the wars, the lack of leadership, and so forth and so on. But in my view, there is a reason why we need to get out of that space, that mindset. And this is where, in this instance, futures literacy, futures research is critical. Key developmental issues, for example, that continue to plague the continent, which looked insurmountable, have been attended to. If you look in the area of health, many of us would never have imagined that solutions could be found to HIV and AIDS. But in many ways, coming from a region where the greatest impact of HIV was felt around 2000, where people were dying literally by the ton load, we have seen a turnaround of the epidemic where the science of HIV and AIDS is so advanced that children who were born with the virus at, for example, 2000 are still alive today, or even earlier, which means something does turn, something does shift. If you look at security, many of us never imagined the moment in 1994, April, when South Africans were able to vote, or that Mandela would leave jail. We had cast our mind to say it will never happen in our lifetime. And many of you may remember the words of Mandela himself when he gave us hope to say, nothing is impossible if we put our human minds to it. So in many ways, the idea that the future is not reachable is perhaps not true. And I think to look at our anthem in Southern Africa, and of course African anthem, particularly Africa, God bless Africa. It does say that we can compose those futures that we want. And I look at this from the point of view of, from the 19th century, the quest for human liberations on the continent, the quest for freedom, starting with the struggles for independence across the continent, leading to the independence of many countries, first in North and West Africa, and eventually coming down south with the, of course, liberation of South Africa in 94. It's been a quest, it's been a journey, but it has happened. So the OAU, in its quest for a total liberation of the continent, brought to us the likes of Kwame Nkrumah, who seemed like a very mad idealist in the 1960s when he put his mind and country to that project. But indeed, the likes of Nkrumah and Nyerere were able to do that. They were able to mobilize their national resource, even the countries of Mali, Nigeria, and so forth, to make sure that their countries put together the material resources, the spaces for young freedom fighters coming from Southern Africa, from SWAPO, from ANC, from PAC, from every one of our struggle movements, to have the freedom to be human, to be a citizen in their own countries. Something we often forget, that it is actually translatable to material things that can change lives. These young people, some of them as young as 13, who was fleeing war in Southern Africa, were able to have a passport and travel. Some even came to this beautiful country and lived here, because another country was able to say, come be part of us, be one of our citizens. Here's something called a passport, go to another country and live a free life. And they've since come back and been part of the transformation of the sub-region, these young leaders. So from OAU to AU, we've seen a vision sparked by a desire for human freedom translating into reality. The OAU is now the AU. It is now embarked on a project of uniting the continent, which of course in another world people would have said, no, that is not possible. But we've seen the European Union itself unite nation states which were beforehand deeply divided by war, by differences of class ideology and other things. So it is my belief that in the same way when we as African citizens put our mind to it, we can remember, literally refabricate the idea of Africa into a united continent. So in my view, the role of African academics is critical to this. First, because we are able to generate the kind of research evidence that informs this project. Coming from Southern Africa, I belong to a region called the Southern African Development Community, or SADC. As some of you might know, the continent is, I would say, broken up, if one could put it that way, into 6 regions. The Southern African region called SADC, and then in West Africa we have the ECOWAS regions, amongst others. And these have, in the last decade, been able to bring forth, I would say, changes that many of us would never have seen possible or thought possible. In West Africa, for example, it is now possible to travel with an ID card, almost as it happens in Europe. This was unheard of because, of course, maybe a decade ago, 40 years ago, we did not have passports. In South Africa, we could not have even IDs or passports because we were not given that opportunity as Black people. Likewise, we've seen the breaking of boundaries and borders in terms of doing business, in that the integration of regions has become more real, enabling the movement of ideas, the movement of people, and the movement of goods. Investment in communication technologies, for example, if I look at Southern Africa, before it was almost impossible to move from the East African coast city of Beira to be able to get into Walvis Bay over an overnight journey. Today it is possible because of investment in road networks, in rail networks. But more importantly, the quantum leap that was enabled by ICTs enabled us to have the kind of telecommunication capability that comes with investment in this instance, the African Optic Fiber Project that enabled the connectivity of the continent. Some may say, well, that is easier to say when we have large parts of the continent still without, for example, basics like electricity. That is true. But at the same time, the science of research that goes into today, solar energy, has suggested that there is an opportunity and a possibility with the right kinds of minds and investment to see what looked like insurmountable barriers now being addressed. And this is where the issue of partnership I'll come to comes in. Clearly, the investment of, for example, international partners moving away from mindsets of giving aid to mindsets of forming partnership has seen, for example, EU and Africa projects that have enabled investment in areas such as education, which I'll speak to in my last slides. And I've seen the transformation of ways in which we put young African minds to school, where beforehand we were educating for, I would say, blue and white collar jobs. It has come to pass that we understand that to achieve the vision of an industrialized continent, we do need the technical skills that come with technical training, something which was not beforehand on the agenda of the African education, I would say, frameworks. And this is where, again, when one looks at what is it that can be done that may look insurmountable happen. And perhaps this is where one wants to look at how do we bring these discussions closer to home. In the context of Africa-Finland relationships, it is my belief, for those of you who may know the history of partnerships between Finland and Namibia, that Finland was critical to the liberation project in Namibia. In fact, I was just saying with tongue in cheek when I came that this is the first time I actually feel truly home, because my name has been something of an enigma to me, because it is not my mother tongue. And in the place village where I come from, I don't find many Alinas. But I had to go into Namibia, particularly in the north, to discover thousands of Alinas, and I was wondering, but where on earth do these come from? Until I was told it is a Finnish name, and I up to now have not discovered what my great-grandparents were doing with Finnish names, but there we are. I suspect it's through religion, but there we are. So I think in highlighting and zooming into the projects that I find, I think, critical in terms of taking a futures lens, it is quite clear that there are a number of areas, as has been said earlier, for theme-based futures literacy thinking or planning or discussions and discourses. Some areas have been already done. In the area of human security, as I've said, we've seen greater investment into unpacking the whole issue of security beyond just conflict management and conflict, post-conflict reconstructions, to looking at it as a much broader interfaced area of work, particularly looking at the impact of climate change on capacity to produce food and therefore create tensions between and within population groups. In the area of education, of course, my keen interest has been in the area of ensuring that young people across the continent can get access to quality education. Now, the issue of quality has been one that has been, of course, a challenge. As I said, when you look at the current status in terms of the continent, there have been these issues that we come to every maybe decade, and this has been the issue of governance. Many people speak to the issue of the continent's challenges with leadership, but I think it is important to point out whether we are looking at leadership that has been weakened, and therefore states that have been weakened by internal factors or external factors. We do or now are able to critique and unpack those causality factors and get beyond them. I think post the Cold War, most of us are aware, again, thanks to archival resources, that what we call the bane of Africa in terms of conflicts have not always been just happenstance. There were constructs, there were ideological projects, but some are behind us. Some may come in the future. In fact, today, as we look at a country like Mali, grappling with governance issues and dealing with complex conflicts, we are aware that, what we now call, even in countries like Nigeria, extreme terror groups. You see, this did not just happen out of the blue. There were projects that were planned, perhaps with collusion from within, but also from without, and that these can be identified and can be addressed in terms of various mediation or peace building strategies. So whether we're looking at weakened states which are fragile, or a new addition to our lexicon in Southern Africa, of course, is captured states. We are dealing with the Commission of Inquiry in South Africa of looking at what we call the capture of the state. The question then is, what can be the role of other actors, in this case, the private sector and civic sector? Now, in the area of education, particularly zooming into the area of technical and vocational education, it is quite clear that we have an opportune moment to reimagine the future. Where technical or artisanal skills have always been shunned or looked at as a poor cousin of having a formal university degree, it is my profound belief that this is an area of opportunity when one looks at new technologies. Clearly, when we conceptualize the idea of technical and vocational education across many countries on the continent, we were thinking of bricklaying and boiler makers, things that perhaps were the skills of our grandparents when they went to the mines. So we shunned them because of the lived experience and history of what they did to suppress or oppress people. But it is my view that when you look at these skills going into the future, they have the capacity to transform and revitalize opportunities for young people. In my other life, I actually am a practitioner in the arts and culture sector. So I've seen how, for example, young Africans have been able to, I would say, excel beyond the idea of excellence in areas of design, or fashion, of creative industries at their length and breadth. And it is clear that for not inculcating these skills from the very level of basic education, of entry into early childhood education, we rob our children of the capacity to imagine creatively alternative education pathways. Right now, our formal education systems literally herd children into streams. You are either going to the sciences or you are a failure. So children are taught that if you cannot get your maths and your science with A's and go into STEM sciences, then you are not worth the soil that you are in. You may as well just pack your bags and go to the village and go and herd goats or something, which is not true. And I think this is where sometimes one looks at flawed informing principles of, I would say, partnerships. Because right now the world, in terms of financing, tends to literally herd us into STEM sciences. And I'm all for STEM sciences, but I believe very much that the capital A, that should be arts, should be inserted into STEM so that young people are able to utilize their creative capabilities, not just to imagine creatively and doodle, and therefore, maybe they'll end up doing Google if they doodle, but they can do other things that can lead them to release their potential that can become their livelihoods in the future. So when one looks at entrepreneurs, many of them are not just drawing on the hard sciences, they draw on soft sciences, soft leadership skills that enable them to function better, whether in corporates or in leading civic society. So in a world of diminishing jobs in public services, it is my belief that civic society is perhaps poised to be part of the true governance partner of governments. We've seen this happen in the area of environmental resource management, where environmental protection has very much taken a civic lead. Whether you are in Rwanda, in Uganda, in Botswana, where there has been, of course, all the discussion and media hype around the management of elephants, or in South Africa with the rhinos. Clearly what has been missed is the role of civic communities, oftentimes not literate in the classic sense of reading, writing English, but with deep knowledge systems about human-animal livelihoods and balancing nature and culture to be able to manage these wildlife resources. Many of us don't know, for example, how human beings living in the Okavango talk with elephants. And this is not to say, shoo, go away, but they do other things that enable them to live with them and share habitats, including with a spoken language or other kinds of signs. But these, of course, have been disrupted because you've taken other ways of, or brought in other ways of trying to bring in managing of these resources. And this has led to a disequilibrium that impacts on ordinary people. So I believe that when we empower civic communities to begin to take the lead and also value them as knowledge holders, we can see other forms of governance and leadership that have hitherto not been valued. Similarly, coming back to the issue of technical skills, the private sector in Africa, although in the main has been a sleeping partner in governing resources, perhaps some will say because they are capital-driven, but also because they were not always brought in as equal partners in governance, have a very significant role to play, which have not always been brought to bear. We have seen the global private sector come in very strongly in the era of HIV/AIDS. If you look at corporates like Merck Company, they have been able to bring in their know-how of pharmaceutical industry to bring in life-changing treatments for free. If I look at Botswana and the HIV/AIDS fight, Merck contributed to the country's development of RT treatment program that has been one of the best practice to date. So in my view, governments where the state has been weakened or has failed or it's fragile or it's collapsed in its entirety, other actors, in this case the private sector and the civic society, can be brought together. In Namibia, for example, we have seen the Namibia Employees Federation play a significant role in partnering with government to ensure that young people can get access to well-funded technical and vocational education that is transferring skills to technical and community-based colleges, that is ensuring that young people who do not get the necessary matric or high school exit pass to enter university can go into vocational schools, get skills, get jobs, and get livelihoods for the future. So it is my belief that if we can turn around or go around the turn of the moment of the ideological, perhaps negative perception of TVET, as we call it, we can begin to see a world where African youth, particularly in this instance, youth who are coming from rural areas, begin to not only gain skills, gain livelihoods, but also perhaps stem one of the great challenges on the continent, which is the rural to urban migration. So while again we've seen the, I would say, sometimes criminalization, to be blunt, of the informal sector where most artisan skills are, it is my belief that when we begin to gain a better understanding and healthier respect for what we call the informal sector, we would be able to give avenues and pathways for young people to be able to leverage their talents and potentials. And in conclusion, I can say, the Africa that perhaps I want, if I go to Agenda 2063, is Africa 2100. And this is because in 2100, my young son, who is now 11, will be 92. It is likely possible that I might still be around, maybe 135 years is not too realistic, but there we are. It is my belief that if we begin to think beyond the numbers 2030, before that's 2015, 2030, 2063, but go a little bit further, we can begin to stretch our imagination, which is an exercise that Riel asked us to think about. But right now we're stretching it just a little, but if we stretch to a little bit further, it is my belief that in 2100, my 11-year-old son would live in a place where he's exercised all his faculties to create the futures that he wants. And a final parting word to borrow a Chinese proverb: if you give me a bowl of rice today, I will eat a meal for the day. But if you give me a hoe, I can feed my family for a lifetime. I thank you.
I'd like to give the opportunity to ask one quick question from Alina. Would somebody have a question ready?
Thank you. My name is Anna Jones, and I'm with the Finland's Futures Research Institute. I want to thank you for your presentation. Very impressive and inspiring.
Thank you.
I have a short story to say because I just wanted to point out that perhaps some of the challenges with having this imagination in Africa might be very localized. Because when you go outside, for example, from my experience, every time I encounter somebody from your culture, for me it's such a inspiration. I had once worked with a colleague, and she was from Africa. She told me how in your culture you come together to pray and to fast when someone has an issue or is ill, and you come together as a community. And there is just one part of the many aspects that your culture has as a potential to really build, to create a different Africa, that the one that you think we have in the outside. So with that, I just want to ask you, what are those signs that you have seen within your local community in Namibia that give us or give your community this sort of perspective of transformation?
Okay. Thank you very much for that. And I'm glad you mentioned people you've met outside, because therein was perhaps a change maker in that the African diaspora didn't get enough time to speak to the issue of the diaspora. The African diaspora is very rich diverse, but very much a vital part of the continent. In fact, it is the sixth region of the African continent in terms of the AU's framing of the regions of the continent. But coming to your point, yes, indeed, one of the things I learned when I was working in the HIV/AIDS field is that oftentimes there were so many indicators, I would say sparks of the future that were in the present that were ignored by science, because science oftentimes doesn't give credit to what I call indigenous knowledge or technology. If I look at the manner in which the treatment of HIV/AIDS turned or took a turn from the hospitalized-based way of approaching illness and disease to a much more comprehensive care, the fourth element of that came from the continent, namely the idea of care, community-based care or home-based care. And this is something that obviously is quite richly spread across the continent in its diversity, but in fact demonstrated without doubt that the care for the alien, the care for people who perhaps are weakened by something can be done without a lot of resources and money. And there are many other examples. The idea of educating children outside of the formal education sector. We always say, and people say this colloquially, it takes a village to raise a child. One of the things that has made me capable as a woman, for example, academic, is having the length and breadth of my extended family in care support for children, in educating children in other forms of knowing other than formal knowledge. But unfortunately, these often come into conflict or clash with formalization. If you look at the formal education sector, which forces young children to make difficult choices, a choice between your mother language and only speaking English in school. In Namibia, for example, we've transitioned from an Afrikaans enforced education system, German education, and now we're going to English. And in between, we lost the capacity to harness local languages that could have enriched. So I think oftentimes there are policy issues that can be overcome, but the resilience within communities is what I think is a vibrant spirit of the continent that we should always look at and say it is possible.
Perfect. Thank you so much.
There was another hand up at the back.
Sorry? Okay. Just a very quick one. We will then move on to the next presentation. And this will be the last question I'll take now. And then the other questions we can ask during the panel discussion.
Thank you. Really quick one. West African. I'm a historian, and I specialize in West Africa. Have you thought about how to, think about a future, especially from the perspective of civilizational clashes? Because you see, you spoke about thinking, like the narrative of the future of Africa, especially through crisis and all that. And it was really interesting when I started to think here on the impact of climate change, on how these crises evolve, you see. And so how do you think probably through these differences in, I like to call them civilizations, like civilizational clashes, like the Fulani, for example. They're a different group of people in Nigeria, and having clashes with, what we would say is kind of like the nation state amidst many other people. So how can we rationalize this clash in a way at the level of civilizations?
Thank you very much. I like that because the thesis, the clash of civilization, I believe from my own academic reading, is a construct in the same way that the nation state in Africa is a construct. If you look at Nigeria, for example, Nigeria was a construction of the British, colonial government. It was carved up into these regions, imaginary regions, and ethnic regions, and construction of ethnic identities, which were given life and reality, oftentimes completely at odds with what was going on. And you see it across the continent in other countries where fixed identities were created out of oftentimes much more fluid identities of people. But we have become so powerfully embedded and entrenched in these fixed identities that the fact that communities intermarry, interact, and that acculturation happens through time and space has been forgotten. So we defend faceless borders as almost immutable truths. So the idea of being Fula or the idea of being Igbo is now so cast in stone in identities of people, even when we know differently. And we then construct this clash of civilizations. And I think it's important to say, at the end of the day, we are all human. And if we can move, and this is where, for me, technologies of looking at peace building beyond the, I'd say, Western lens is important. When you look at how communities engage, if you look at Rwanda post-genocide, and the construction of a post-genocide society in Rwanda happened, a lot of that had to do with going deeply into the cultures of people before the constructs of being Tutsi or being Hutu happened. And we're able to go beyond that and able to find ourselves in our common humanity and say, we are not either pastoralist or farmer. I'm not either hunter-gatherer or we can be. And I think this is a kind of maybe abstract but very important to take on mindsets that someone like Nelson Mandela had. At the 94 cusp of independence, there was either a choice to expel white people from South Africa and say the land is all ours, or to create a new nation society that embraced all in the diversity. So for me, the clash of civilization is oftentimes a construct that needs us to have a much more high resolution set of tools, particularly as intellectuals, to overcome and not succumb to it. Unfortunately, there are many who thrive and drive it within our context as academics, so intellectuals, and it is a bit unfortunate. And I think we can actually find tools beyond and to embrace. If you look at, for example, just one last comment, if you look at West Africa coming to, again, Jene Jeno, oftentimes people would posit Jene Jeno and that period as Arab influence, but forgetting that there was a huge community of local indigenous skills that embraced the other culture, and that the hybridization happened over a long time, and it is now part and parcel of the fabric of being Malian. But today we cast them as almost binaries, which is not the case. So I think as a historian, it's important that maybe we have this conversation later. How can we create a better understanding of African civilizations and cultures different from the construct of either ors? Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Elina.
Thank you.
I'm very happy to present our last speaker, Laura Porou from the Finland Futures Research Center. She's the project lead for the Unesco Chair on Learning Society and Futures of Education. The Unesco Chair has the aim of making use of tools of futures research to eradicate global poverty and improve human well-being in developing countries. Laura is managing the research, education, and development activities of this chair. Welcome, Laura.
Good morning. I'm happy to be here sharing briefly our work, what we have been doing on promoting futures literacy in Finland. As most of you probably know, the Finland Futures Research Center is the only academic institute in Finland that is doing futures research and giving futures education, and probably the only one of the few ones in globally as well. And the center was founded in 1992, so that makes that today we have 27 years of experience in doing these things. And in order to honor this experience, UNESCO granted our professor Markku Vilenius 3 years ago this honorary UNESCO professorship, UNESCO chair, with the title of Learning Society and Futures of Education. So that's what we have been working on the past 3 years. And we decided to use this opportunity because one of the purposes of the UNESCO chairs is to act kind of bridge builders between the academic world and the wider society. So we decided to use this opportunity to make future studies more easily accessible to the wider civil society. And in other words, bring futures literacy to the society. And we decided to focus particularly on young people. How you can integrate methods of teaching futures to schools or through non-formal learning. Here is some pictures from the teacher trainings and the student groups that we've been working with. And why did we choose teenagers or young people as our main target group? This slide is unfortunately in Finnish, but it is a live poll that we conducted at Martin Laakson Lukio last autumn. We asked the students to write one word that describes their feelings towards future. Or the question is, how does the future feel like? And as you can see, there's 195 answers, and the most common, the boldest ones are exciting, scary, uncertain, followed by hope and hopeful, oppressive, interesting, concerning, and so on. We've also done this kind of a poll with other student groups and also with some teacher groups, and the result is always somewhat similar, that the future raises different kind of emotions and that they are not always positive ones. So that's why we want to give the young people tools to deal with these thoughts about the future. Because, like Riel said, the thoughts that we have of future affect our actions in the present, which then, on the other hand, starts to shape the future. So it's kind of a loop, that what you think about the future has an impact on the present. But then, if we want to take futures literacy or deepen the futures literacy approach in schools, we were thinking that we have to make it more tangible and more concrete in order it to be easily applicable in the school educational curricula. So this is our current framework that we are still working on. But we have been combining here the long tradition of futures education that has been done in Finland at least since 1990s, and then the recent research in anticipation. So we have divided that futures literacy, or if you are a futures literate person, it consists of cognitive, motivational, and active skills levels. I will briefly go this through. So the cognitive capacity, this builds strongly on the traditional futures education. Well, if you are futures literate, you have to first of all understand the current world where we are living in. But then on the other hand, you should also understand the temporal change dynamics, the relationship of past, present, and the future, and that we have some phenomena like trends and megatrends that have a traceable history and that will keep on happening and they will most likely shape the future. But then that there are also events like black swans that you cannot just predict, and they will also make an impact on the future. So understanding kind of this, how the future emerges. And then also it's important to understand like the basic foundations of how future takes place, such as that future can never be 100% surely predicted, or that it's not predestined, and that there are always, at any point, there is always alternative futures that can take place. So it's important to understand these basics of the future, and then moving on to the motivational capacity. As we saw, future is also very emotional. We all have assumptions and expectations and hopes and fears regarding the future. So it's important to become aware of these and how they are directing your actions. And then it's also been researched that people can have different kind of attitudes towards future. In the other end is a passive attitude towards future, that you just go with the flow and don't believe that you have much to impact on how the future will be like. And then in the other end is a proactive futures attitude, which means that you believe that you can yourself make an impact on the future. And then of course our values impact what kind of a future we consider as preferable or non-preferable. And then at the third level, we believe that futures literacy is also about action. It's been studied that when students are exposed to futures education and they gain more awareness of future, then it often results that they want to take action and do something about the future. So that's why we have we are calling these skills active skills, how you become an active future maker. And we believe these are the ones that will be needed more and more in the coming decades. So the first set of skills we call planetary living skills. Here we have the person's one's relationship with the nature in the focus. Because in these days when we are spending a lot of time on digital devices and living in urban surroundings, we easily lose this connection with the nature, even though it's important. Our connection with the nature is important to our own well-being, but also for creating this sense of responsibility for your own environment and the planet that we are living on. And then the next one is complexity skills, and these deal with living in the increasingly complex society and making sense of complexity, like Reel says, and like functioning in complex decision-making situations. And here we have emphasized the role of systems thinking, the understanding that how the world and single phenomena are actually linked together. And then creativity skills. In the information-driven world, we shouldn't forget our creative side and our imagination, because it's needed in solving these probably upcoming complex problems, and also in imagining new kind of futures. And also questioning the future images that are given us by the society. And then lastly, empathy skills. Here we want to draw focus on moving out from the highly individualized culture and thinking about like, well, what will the future give to me? And instead of thinking like, how can I contribute in making the future a better place for the current generations and the upcoming generations. And our hypothesis is that once a person has these capacities and once a person is a futures literate, then then it kind of makes you more resilient to navigate in the present and in the future, and whatever the future will be like, you are better prepared to face it. And also you have this proactive futures mindset to impact the future. And then a couple of examples what we have been doing in practice. We have been, like I already showed some pictures, we have been having a couple of pilot courses with the Finnish high schools, and we've been training teachers, and we are kind of putting together this approach how you can teach futures literacy. It's now our goal is to have a guidebook ready by next spring, and we will also translate it in English. And we've been collaborating with a Finnish company, Funtsi, who is specialized in delivering mobile pedagogy, mobile learning to developing countries. We have put together this simple course on futures literacy. It consists of 3 modules that kind of cover these elements that I was just talking about. And then we have organized 2 National Futures Days in order to get wider attention to futures literacy and raise the general futures awareness in the society. The first Futures Day we organized together with Tulevaisuuskoulu. It's a future school. It was last year, and it was targeted for schools. And the idea of a Futures Day is that anybody can organize their own Futures Day in their own community. So there isn't like one centralized event, but there are multiple events at the same day in Finland. And this Futures Day got some attention in the media and some discussion, why was this only for schools, that we would also need Futures Day in our working place. So this year we decided to go big and call it the world's largest discussion on futures. And we invited the whole Finnish society to join, the companies, the municipalities, the museums and libraries. And we had some remarkable patrons for the event, like here is Tarja Halonen, our former president. And in order to make the participation easy, we provided this set of materials that you can use in organizing your Futures Day. We provided some materials in Finnish and in English, but then our colleagues in the Teach the Future global network heard about this, and they got inspired, and then our materials were translated in several languages, and now they can be found in Spanish, Dutch, Portuguese, Arabic, and in other languages as well. And this kind of got us by surprise that then in the end, on the 1st of March, we actually had more than 70 registered events happening in Finland in all kind of educational institutes, starting from primary schools to universities, and also in one elderly care house here in the bottom, and then in various municipalities and libraries and museums. And the Futures Day was the most tweeted topic of the day with more than 650 tweets. So I guess it was a kind of a success of raising a future awareness of the Finnish society. And also globally, we got partners. These pictures are from the Tatjana's network that operates in network of future-oriented teachers in Eastern Europe and Russia. So that's briefly our work, and to conclude, I guess our sense, our feeling is now that it seems that there is a lot of demand for this kind of tools for futures literacy in the society.
Thank you, Laura, for the very inspiring and energizing presentation. Would somebody want to pose a quick question on the work that has been done on futures literacy here in Finland?
I'm Heidi Kinnunen from the University of Helsinki. Yesterday at my university we were discussing about our strategy for the next 10 years. And one of the very key issues we discussed about is how to make sure that our students become critical ethical thinkers and how to ensure that. Now that I'm being here today, I feel that one of those things that might help would be teaching them this kind of future literacy skills. Mm-hmm. How would you bring such skills to university teaching?
Futures literacy?
Exactly.
Well, I guess at the University of Turku we have a long experience of giving futures education. But then if you want particularly futures literacy, I guess it can be done integrating it to like orientation week or, I don't know, a special module on futures literacy. I'm sure there is a ways to integrate it. But we have now been mainly working on with the secondary schools and not so much with universities.
Just to,
Mm-hmm.
if I can,
Probably
just to add to that, because it's exactly the kind of collaboration. One of the things that's happening is that we're better able to structure those kinds of courses as we begin to understand anticipatory systems and assumptions. And you can see work that's going on, for instance, at Hansa, where they've decided to provide all the undergraduates, 30,000, with an initial training in futures literacy, which is being collaboratively produced with the different universities around the world. It's part of what the Unesco chairs are working on, how to introduce futures literacy from a university perspective with the theory and the practice in a coherent framework. So that's something that's currently underway, and of course if there's interest at the University of Helsinki, we'd be glad to kind of join together to do that.
Thank you so much, Brielle, for that addition. Thank you, Laura. Let's give her a round of applause. I know we've been sitting now for about 2 hours. I would like to propose that you all stand up, stretch your legs a little bit, as we are then moving into the panel discussion. I'm very pleased to invite Mr. Itonde Kakoma, Program Director Africa from the Crisis Management Initiative, Mr. Jorma Korhonen, Director, Prime Minister's Office, advancing the relationship between EU and Africa during Finland's presidency of the Council of the European Union. And then Dr. Sini Paukkunen, Director, Policy Planning and Research, Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And then if all the speakers would also join us in the panel in the round. Thank you so much. Yes. It's just too amazing of an opportunity to leave the speakers go and let them go. So we wanted to have a small discussion round with all the panelists. And I would actually like to make a question to all of you. Now that we have been listening to the presentations and the insights, how do you feel futures literacy could help to change our hopes and expectations on the future? If Riel, you would start with that.
One, two. Yes, very good. The thing is that a baby anticipates. You know, a baby will anticipate being fed. A baby will anticipate something that's moving and coming towards them. They will imagine the future, even without words or before having a framework. So anticipation is very fundamental to all living things. And I didn't talk about Robert Rosen and anticipatory systems and how it's a basic component of biology. But I think that the issue here becomes one which was very much a point that I appreciated in the presentation from Melina, which is that this issue of identity and the question of how identity gets constructed in terms of the past, but also in terms of the filters, like the civilizational filter. In other words, as we become more able to understand our anticipatory systems and assumptions, we become better able to understand our hopes and our fears and to construct them on an ongoing basis and to not be fixed into one version of hope, one version of fear, or saying, look, the only way I'm ever going to get married is if I can predict I will be happy all my life. This is completely ridiculous. We know that. And yet we still have this tendency often to lock ourselves into ideas of, I can only take this step if I'm certain, if I know for sure. Just to use it, and I think that this is the key here. And I think it relates also to the way we teach and experience learning about anticipation, is that by improving our capacity to understand anticipatory systems and assumptions and become better able to play with our assumptions, we'll be in a better position to address hopes and fears.
Thank you, Jana. I think the question is rather philosophical. And first of all, I think we have to realize always the plural in the futures, how multiple they are. I mean, traveling 100 kilometers from Helsinki, from the city center where we are now, go to Kouvola, I don't know. I think we have different micro-universes there, and the expectations, hopes and fears may be similar, but they are still very different. And that's why, it's even more multiple in Africa, and that's something we have to bear in mind. And maybe another similar point is the inclusiveness. In many presentations, we talk a lot about it. And I was very happy when I saw the picture about the elderly care home in your presentation, because usually when we talk about futures, we talk about children, we talk about the youth, sometimes even about us middle-aged, but we shouldn't forget about the elderly. I think they have a lot to contribute. Thanks.
Thank you very much. I work in the field and area of peace mediation, specifically concerning the resolution, prevention, mitigation of violent and or political conflict. And in order to do that effectively, or in any meaningful sense, a sense of the future is critical. Anticipation is critical. And there's so many themes that have come up today that I'd love to explore more deeply. And you just touched on one of them, namely on inclusion, which is a core principle around what makes potentially for a more sustainable peace process. That is, who is participating in any kind of process that could lead towards, again, the prevention, resolution, or mitigation of a violent political conflict, and the politics around selecting participation have everything to do with hopes and fears. If you are not involved, if you do not have a say in the future political dispensations or arrangements of bringing to an end a violent or political conflict, your sense of ownership is violated, and thus fears engulf what could be a more hopeful moment. If I could just point to one anecdote, I think the hope, if you will, around future literacy in the areas that I work have also a means to address two of the issues that you raised in your presentation, sir, concerning the fear of uncertainty and fetishism around immortality. And I say this with great humility, but I'll say it anyway. The continent of Africa is facing such grand generational seismic shifts at the moment. And I'm not sure those who follow, those who are involved, those who live and breathe and lead various states and communities are aware of that monumental shift that is taking place on scale of the independence era. And we do not have to look further than Algeria to Sudan to Ethiopia and elsewhere to realize how profound systemic changes are taking place and being demanded from all quarters. And it has much to do with these two of many points that you raised around fear of the uncertainty and fetishism around immortality. The structure of how governance has been handled in many, not all. I think we have very good examples from Namibia to Botswana to elsewhere in terms of participatory democracies. But you can still lift up the hood a bit and look at what the political ideologies and liberation movements mean for the identity of statehood. And I think a very clear trend that should be taken seriously, and I'll stop here, would be in the last popular elections in South Africa and Tanzania. Both countries that have been at the forefront of liberation movements since the independence and post-independence eras. Both countries still led by those historic liberation movements, if you will, CCM in Tanzania, ANC in South Africa. But what's the trend I'm referring to? Neither party, despite that heritage, managed to convince the urban centers of either state. Meaning, both in the context of South Africa and in the context of Tanzania, the urban votes were not what brought them or maintained power. It was the rural votes. And this is significant given the trends that we're talking about here, rapid urbanization. And yet, those historic movements don't manage to convince. Political ideology and that heritage of independence is not enough to preserve and to entice the hopes of the urban centers, which not only reflect the elite view, but it reflects the academic centers, the rapid, youthful centers of young men, many of whom are unemployed, but also the burgeoning middle class, dominated by young women, not reflecting the way in which politics currently are led. And that's a powerful future trend across the continent, and I'm not sure it's fully grasped yet in terms of what it means for the current and future trends of society.
Thank you very much. I think you've touched on many critical points that one could highlight, and I appreciate that particular changing of the dynamic on the continent. Perhaps for me, the issue then is how do we continue to work at the margins, to change the margins and bring them closer to the center? Because again, when you look at the patterns on the continent, is that we've had indeed what one could call a big man politics from liberation. So we talk about our fathers of liberation, and increasingly these margins become a lot more clearer in that those who were underrepresented, marginalized, are gaining more traction in terms of voice. And this speaks to me about the idea of meaningful inclusion, I must say that I'll always speak about the youth, but qualifying that a bit, I'd say the youth in terms of language and languages, in that perhaps we've ignored the fact that language should be much more than just a spoken language that we use to teach, to educate in schools, but other forms of languages. And in this area, I think the whole way in which we communicate and co-create knowledge becomes critical to look at is how we can begin to construct new tools for the future about how we can. And I'm glad my brother mentions peace building, because oftentimes the tools that we use for doing post-conflict peace building are built on methodologies and I'd say instruments that are also borrowed. But we are beginning to see elements of, I'd say, indigenous means and technologies of building peace that go beyond the textbook, literally. And we are seeing people draw on other forms of skills that begin to say we can build peace together by drawing on other things. And this comes to the issue also of intergenerational communications and conversations. And we are seeing excellencies of harnessing the elderly to become, I would say, bridges builders for young children who are, for example, urban. Orphans who are having a very difficult challenge of orphan burden, but linking young orphans with the elderly to begin to create, I'd say, socially innovative mechanisms of ensuring communication happens. We see new, I'll say, tentacles of hope building that are new, that are, I'd say, fresh, and I'm very eager to see how we can harness those and perhaps bring them to the tools and methodologies that Riel spoke to. So that is perhaps our intellectual challenge in institutions. Thank you.
Now that we heard many insights, I'd actually like to add another question to Mr. Korhonen. Now that you are advancing the relationship between European Union and Africa during the Finland's presidency of the Council of the European Union, what is the present thinking in developing the relationship, and perhaps what are sort of the instruments? If you could elaborate a little bit on that. You may touch also on the previous question as well.
Thank you. Maybe I would like to say a couple of words on previous question first, and say that the futures learning, it's really important to understand that there are difficult, but there are different choices. To see the choices, and I believe that the real you in your presentation, you mentioned that the choices are in the future, but they change things we make today. They change the present. And I believe that's the very crucial element of future learning overall. It's not about future as such that happens somewhere, but it's about the reality as it is now. And it's really important. One more thing on here, I think it's crucial as well that we are not doing things on our own, but we are doing things together with our partners, like in Africa, really forming a partnership, understanding not only having our own views, how the future we would like to see to happen, or to see the options, but understanding what are the other views on the other side, to have the ownership from the African side. And I think that's the only way of going forward in the partnership. When I was listening to Alina's presentation, I thought in often points that she doesn't only have a Finnish first name, she thinks like a Finn. And good or bad, I don't know. But I pretty much have the same notes in my own books, how we should go forward. And now the second question you ask about the Africa and the Finnish presidency of the Council. Africa, it's a prominent thing in all programs and all actions. the present government. It's in the government program, it's in the EU program, and when you go to the EU side, it's in the EU programs as well. In strategic program, for example, Africa is a very prominent element. And the EU, as we as well, we would like to forge a strong partnership. Africa having a ownership in this partnership. And I see it's in fact a continuation after 2017 Abidjan meeting. That was a meeting that changed, I think, in many ways the thinking. It was a partnership meeting. It was a meeting of changing and giving the ownership to Africa. It was a meeting where jobs were discussed, about the economic growth, and really broadening the agenda from development to other issues. Security, I liked very much what Alina said about the security, a broad concept of security, not only the hardcore of the security. Then you have the trade relations to create wealth, have inclusiveness, having civil society, but as well business, making that reality happen, and making, especially making the investments to take place in order to create the jobs that are needed. And to conclude, I see that this is something that is not needed and beneficial only for one part. This is something we both need, and that is what a partnership is all about.
And Laura, when you answer the question, I'd also like to hear, have you been able to see during the program that you have been running now for a couple of years, how that impacts the future literacy of the participants? And is there any elements of hopefulness that you can see in the results?
Yes, can I first say something about the... Yes, I just wanted to say that I guess the futures literacy as such might necessarily not change your hopes and fears, but it makes you more conscious of them, and that's the important role of it. And it helps you to see the alternatives, which is probably which can raise the hopefulness. Then about, I guess measuring futures literacy is something that we have been discussing a lot in the Futures Literacy Network. There still isn't any explicit metrical tools how you can measure a person's futures literacy. But what we have done with our pilot courses, we have used our colleagues Matti Minkkinen and Sanna Ahvenharju have developed this tool on person's futures consciousness, which builds on very strongly on the same elements as futures literacy. So we have conducted this survey in the beginning of the courses and in the end of the courses to see if there's a change in the students' futures consciousness. But unfortunately, we haven't yet analyzed the data. We have had other things, so we haven't had time to do that yet. But the feedback that we have gotten in other ways from the students and from the teachers, I think the most common has been that this has widened my thinking, that it has opened up new perspectives. So I think that kind of indicates that it has some kind of impact.
Just to kind of supplement that point, there are efforts underway to create indicators and to understand better what it means to be more futures literate in the same way that you would do reading and writing skill levels. And the relationship between sort of optimism or pessimism is, I think, very open, because optimism and pessimism are things that come and go and that are contextual. But the ability to develop alternatives and to use your imagination more effectively and to understand why something frightens you and then, in some senses, deflate it is really crucial. And can I say, just in terms of what's been raised from the point of view of inclusiveness, but also from the point of view of the ideological battlefields of the, let's say, 19th and 20th century, it seems to me pretty obvious that we can't be all inclusive here just at the level of communicating unless people make the investment in English, which I'm very grateful for. In other words, what I'm saying is that there are ingredients, there are capabilities that without which inclusion is not even possible. And the same thing goes for alternative images of development, whether it's the industrial image of Soviet and Chinese communist futures, which were crucial to the image of the future that they used, of an industrial, manufacturing, worker-based future. Our ability to diversify and to root in authentic historical ways our ideas of development seems to me both inclusion and development now are contingent on us becoming more capable of understanding why we make certain assumptions about the future and about how to construct our images of the future. And without that capability, we will not be able to get beyond some of the ideological dualisms, some of the simplistic battles that currently don't offer very much hope to anybody. Because people say, with climate change, none of that's going to work out anyhow. We need transformation. And how do I create an inclusive process when I've defined the process in advance? In other words, one of the aspects of inclusion that is altered by being able to understand the role of the future is co-creation. I don't know. I'm going to co-create it with you. And I don't need to know in advance. I don't need ex ante, prior predictive certainty that this will work. I can feel my way. I can let it emerge, because my idea of the future is not a fixed future, which opens up a different avenue to inclusion, not as inclusion in something that exists, but actually, hey, we're going to create something together, and guess what? It might mean that we go in different directions, but we've done it in a way that's mutually reinforcing, that has a relationship as the foundation for defining the world around us. So that's, I mean, I think that we're in this transition period.
I think, Riel, you have said at some point that reading and writing brings a society and enables a different level of development for a society. And then if people are futures literate, there is like a different model for creating peace and for thinking about well-being and development. Now, Mr. Kakoma, coming into peace mediation processes, in futures thinking we have the methodology of co-creation, like Riel was just mentioning, collaboration, participation. And I have read, you have mentioned that the best long-term solution to prevent and resolve conflict is to improve governance at the national level. So how would futures literacy perhaps help in this work, and what are the factors what are affecting peace and security issues that have implications for potential governance questions? And then perhaps a follow-up question still, how could universities or academics support in these challenges?
I like having these big question conversations. It's a privilege, so thank you. Look, on the governance question, and why I referred to the electoral experiences in South Africa and Tanzania, which were very volatile in their unpredictability because of the stability of both political parties in those respective societies for so long, and the uncertainty of what change would mean in their absence. And what we've observed with respect to governance, here I'm focusing on the urban centers because it's a distinct futures in the plural reality, as you rightly said, from other centers within those societies, is a demand for basic forms of governance. And I'd be interested in hearing from you, Madam, because my sensibility at the moment is that the quote-unquote best and brightest, unlike the independence era of the African continent, are not pursuing necessarily public office. They're interested in governments providing service delivery in order for them to thrive in other fields, entrepreneurially, as independent actors. And that's a very profound shift, again, in terms of what power and influence looks like and what expectations mean for basic delivery of services. I think a similar kind of conundrum is how you have this, yes, it's a global phenomenon, but it's also particular in its expression on the African continent in terms of urban cultures that are increasingly nuanced but ubiquitous, from Nairobi to Kampala to elsewhere, with respect to identity and culture. And this is a challenge also for future trends. If we draw upon cultural heritage as a means of envisioning what future governing systems might look like, well, future trends currently suggest that urban centers are leaning towards a more nuclear form of family. Why? Because you can sustain your well-being and income in a much more predictable way than if you are a part of a cultural network of tens, 20s to hundreds of individuals who you are supporting. And the urban nature of that is very nuclear, down to the familial level of what my household entails. And that's a new trend that my generation is facing in various urban centers across the African continent. And it has profound implications for language, for cultural memory, for reliance upon knowledge of who you are beyond your immediate circles, and thus also has implications for political affiliation, because it's not necessarily based on tribal or linguistic identity, but again, back to can you deliver basic services? I think a separate conundrum that we reflect on, and this is a question posed to me personally by the African Union leadership, is what can we say, or what do we see about the way in which the trends in the Middle East, post-Arab Spring, what does that say about possible trends on the African continent? I don't know, but there's a couple. Ungovernable spaces will not be left as a vacuum. Someone will fill it with imagination, and someone will predict others' futures by way of establishing other norms in the absence of the state functioning for the peripheral. And that's what brings about, in addition to many other factors, the rise of ISIS, ungovernable territories. And it's also been a check on what military and political interventions look like in unpredictable political circumstances. I don't think it's in anyone's interest to see another Libya emerge on the continent of Africa. I don't think the balance, the equilibrium would hold. It's too fragile to have another totally dismembered society, disenfranchised, unraveled state. And thus, the way in which Sudan is being approached, the way in which Algeria is being approached, arguably even Ethiopia, is in a very delicate way of enabling change, but not in a way that brings about drastic, unpredictable, ungovernable
I'd like to pose a question to Ali now on the future of education, and then linking to what Mr. Kakoma was just saying. If we look at Africa's current experience with the education sector, what would you propose as a more relevant future education system? And then linking, when we discussed, I would also very much like to hear, if we look at this complex global environment, what can Africa contribute towards more sustainable futures?
Thank you for the question. I think one of the things that, at least in retrospect, I have come to learn and appreciate is the way in which, despite the challenges, despite the fracturing of, say, communities and societies through wars, that the resilience of people, what we call Ubuntu, the spirit of being human and humane, has been a thread that unites people across time and space. Now, in terms of education, I think one of the things that has happened, and again, we may differ sometimes on this with colleagues, is the role of language in education. In that, at independence, out of necessity, we adopted, or governments consciously chose to adopt, say, European languages and continue with them and privilege them, save for Tanzania, of course. And people often point out that, well, look where Tanzania got. But what was lost in that is the richness which, say, Kiswahili enabled ordinary Tanzanians to come to greatness, to come to well-being. So in many ways, for not investing in our languages, local languages, on the continent at independence has robbed us of the capabilities of millions. And I think South Africa is beginning to show that with the conscious investment in currently the 11 languages that are being used. So we see that experiment working to transform education. The fruits are not there perhaps as well as we would like them to be, and one doesn't expect to be rapid. So in my view, I think in terms of education, that is one strand. The other strand is what we have perhaps valorized, in that areas such as civics were not invested in pursuit of what I see as a technicalization of education, the obsession with STEM as a transformative opportunity. One, in fact, is the soft skills of civics education, which can help. I, like my brother, when I look at the area of peace building, see how we have not invested consciously in the area of peace education. Again, coming to South Africa, if you look at the current post-conflict environment, particularly the urban areas, the poorer areas, the rise of gangs and violence in schools is really depleting the opportunity, the moment for rebuilding the nation. And when you look at the causal drivers, one of those has been that we forgot as we went through the area of post-conflict rebuilding, rights education, we forgot responsibilities and values. So in my view, there's still a very huge role of the essence of Ubuntu, is it Harambee spirit, that should come into our curricula, and that is peace education. Over and above that, looking at how critical thinking skills and leadership skills can be inculcated through our education system from very elementary basic education levels can begin to perhaps add to the understanding of why it matters that we can interrogate governance when we get to the age of voting. What we tend to do is wait until children are 18 and then say, you have the right to vote, but they have no preparation to become a voting citizen. And that is not for me by accident. It is because it is convenient that leaders have, as the under-educated voters, then they don't ask the right questions. But in my view, our education systems have a responsibility to rethink the curriculum and reinsert back Not only the technical aspect that will empower young people to be able to drive their own knowledge, skills, and future entrepreneurship, but also the skills that will make them much more capable thinkers, particularly thinkers with empathy around choices of who should lead and why should they lead. So the ethic of leadership should be part of our education system curricula, which currently it's left to chance, I would say. Thank you.
Just a little thing that I'd like to highlight there, which has to do with the power of the assumptions that we make. And two of them seem to me to be highlighted. Lena, you've already made reference to them, but they come out in the other discussions, and the inclusiveness and the question of how to create relationships. One is scale. Implicit in almost everything we do is this notion that we should find something that's scalable. Let's find something that will apply to everybody. That's the ticket, that's the secret, that's the thing that will make us successful. And it's an obvious lesson of industrial society. Since the 19th century, success has been built upon uniformity, homogenization, one language. The nation state where every worker can speak the same language, whether they came from one region or another, so they can all work together in the factory. Okay? The other is technocratic. That there's a technocratic hierarchy and that we should acquire technocratic knowledge rather than the capacity to be inventive, to learn, to adapt, to be open, but rather there's a hierarchy of skills and that technocratic knowledge can be learned in a kind of rote fashion, and that's the kind of mechanistic notion of STEM, but it's also deeply embedded in the kind of easy image of the future based on technology, because technology is easy to extrapolate. So you can extrapolate better, faster cars without gasoline, without fossil fuels, and without drivers. It's easy to do. Jules Verne, we've been doing it for more than a century. So we get caught up in scale, we get caught up in technocratic, technological ways of imagining the future, and we don't question those underlying assumptions which frame our idea of the future. And to me, we need to not only be able to question those assumptions, but we have to then be able to invent other futures outside those assumptions, which means, again, you won't be surprised, futures literacy is important.
Yeah, I think the challenge is in revealing those underlying assumptions. We so much focus on sort of the things that are on the surface, but it's like an iceberg. We see the tip of the iceberg, but the underlying assumptions which are below, this is not something that is visible, but we should make it visible, and that through futures literacy. Jorma, you had a comment.
Yeah, I would like to make a couple of very brief comments. I think first going to governance and governability overall, I think in the essence it's a question of education, school, at the very bottom of the pyramid. If you have a schooling system, you prepare your citizen to vote, you prepare your citizens, give knowledge, give possibility to understand what the political system is, how it works. In the end, it adds up to governability. The language issue as such, it's interesting that some of you might know that we have a bit of a language discussion here at home as well. We have two official languages, but in the north we have a Sami language, and for a very long time the Sami language, those who spoke it, they were treated pretty much the same way. The Sami was not allowed to be used. All schooling was done in Finnish. And now this is not the case anymore. And then you come into a question of richness of the culture, or having a language that is, should I say, more usable in a general context, or having a both, but how to strike the balance between. Today there is a I would say a not so different discussion going on whether it should be English only used at the university, because it gives much more access to the world than the Finnish language does. And I believe that discussion is still pending.
Absolutely. And for perhaps some viewers, we might be, this is streamlined live, and I know there are some people outside of Finland looking and listening to this. Sami people are the only indigenous people in the European Union that Jorma was now referring to. Now I'd like to pose a question to Sini. There are so many issues. I think you kind of have a role of a little bit of wrapping up. Now we've been able to ask some questions from each. I would like to still give the opportunity for our public as well to pose some questions. But Sini, so now Alina was mentioning Ubuntu. I love this concept, and it links it with the empathy skills that you have in your skill set. Soft skills was mentioned. Now, could futures literacy be like an element of soft power? And how do you see the relation between futures literacy and development cooperation? And I know you've been to Africa, both for work and for leisure, for holidays. So you probably have quite a few takeaways from those trips that you might want to share with us. Especially now we also touched upon religion. So there are many issues that you could bring to the table. But I think the soft power and especially the development cooperation would be interesting as you are at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs.
Thanks a lot, Jana. A huge question. I try to somehow package it in a meaningful way. Yes, I think futures literacy is in a way soft power, as is language. I mean, language is not only means of communication. It's really a way to construct our reality. And as a civil servant, as a planner, I think for me it's important to, when we talk about futures literacy or about future skills, to differentiate a bit the levels. We can use it as a planning tool. I mean, we can use it in Finland in planning foreign policy, also in planning development policy. This is something we've been discussing with colleagues, that it's important to mainstream and integrate this kind of futures thinking into the work we do. But secondly, there's a governance level with our partners in Africa, for example. I wouldn't like to put this all within the development framework, because then we are already making our Africa relationship more narrow. I mean, it's about business, it's about trade, it's about security. So it's a big entity. It involves everything we are doing, and development is one angle as such. But then there's this education part of it. I mean, there's plenty of talk about global crisis of education. Education is very high on our new government program with regard to development. But then there's the university part of it. And then at the end, which I find very important, is the so-called grassroots level and the tools that people may have to, it's a tool of empowerment. And those of you who were involved with development cooperation in last millennium, 90s, it was very fashionable to work through the participatory research and action method, which is actually rather, it has many similar elements to futures literacy, about the inclusiveness, participatory approach, where actually everybody can be an expert of his or her future. And so, I mean, a farmer, a taxi driver, and even a mother who has kids in school can be a kind of expert. So, I mean, there are many old elements that are packaged in a new way, in a future-oriented way, and this is something we should remember. As our State Secretary mentioned in the beginning, of course, many development agencies also use already some future skills and Delphi methods and Foresight methods, so that's part of the planning. But there are these different layers where maybe we should we should consider very carefully, I mean, what are the assets for us? I mean, as a Finn, I think we would be rather credible actor in promoting futures skills and literacy, because we have the elements here back home. We have the academic part, we have the practitioners part, we have the governmental part, but not only because it's fashionable, but actually because it can bring some transformative elements and change. And as a real Miller sits next to me, I can only thank him for some very good contacts I got for a trip in West Africa, and also the inspiration started in an EU networking meeting. So we see it's very important to share and pool. I mean, we don't need to reinvent anything. But as an anecdote, I really want to say, to meet some of these practitioners of Foresight and futures literacy, I thought I would do something differently. I thought I will be very different diplomat, and I took a bus from Lagos to Cotonou. It was meant to take 4 hours, it took 14 hours. And what happened, half an hour before the bus had left Lagos, a priest stepped in, and 1.5 hours non-stop gospel. And in that, or during that bus trip, I think I learned more about Africa and about its futures I had ever learned in 5 years on the continent. And it really reminded me of one fact, only one of many, that when we talk about futures, it's much about faith, it's much about destiny, and religion is really, I mean, it's really inborn in many, African, not inborn, but it's so present in many African societies in a different way. And also when we talk about African futures, it's something that we can't really ignore, and especially when talking about the futures. But it was just a personal learning experience.
Thank you for that, Silly. Now I'm very conscious about the time, but I would like to ask if somebody would have a question in the public. Yes.
Thank you so much. This has been a very fascinating morning. My name is Leena Vastapuu. I come from Tampere Peace Research Institute. My background is in international politics. So the word that comes to my mind now is realpolitik. So the real thing that is happening on everyday policy making. So my worry is time. So if we want our politicians, our decision makers to imagine how the future could be, they need time, but they don't have time. So the question is, how could we organize, or what could we do about this? And does this worry you as well? This is so fascinating and wonderful, so I really worry about this. And I have a challenge for you, Laura. Maybe you could organize some kind of training for our new politicians, our new government. Just challenge them to join you for a weekend getaway for imagining futures. Thank you.
I think the issue of urgency, there's a colleague of ours, Bayo Akomolefe from Nigeria, who says, times are urgent, we should slow down. And I think that there is a crucial question here about different temporalities, and it's always been referred to in terms of the different levels, but also in terms of language and how language frames temporality. I mean, one of the things about understanding anticipatory systems is understanding how language treats time and how humans incorporate time into their thinking, that we have. And so all of that, I think, is kind of in transition, which is, to me, a good thing in many ways. But I have to say that one aspect of the immortality issue is that that kind of removes time. And one aspect of what's going on today, I think, is to realize that birth and death, that things that end and things that are born, and destruction and creation are all part of this dynamic. And to I was very, very struck, and I think it's partly this urgency issue in climate change, for instance, and the extinction movement, is that, and we've already heard it here many times, power is much more diffused throughout society than at the pinnacles of what appear to be the kind of places of power. And I think that's one of the aspects of the present context, is it's giving us a lot of reasons to diversify the learning and to diversify temporality, so that we're learning in many different places and power is diffused throughout the society. And in that sense, it relates to this artificial nation-state borders, boundaries, identities. I mean, let's face it, the identities that were fixed and were considered constant and were considered permanent and were considered something I could give you or force you to adopt as identity, I mean, that's no longer tenable. In many, many different ways. Some from volition, because I don't want to be restrained, but some because it's being destroyed by outside and other forces. But all of that means that we need to be able to be more fluid, more open, more multiple, and that requires capability. And so there we come back to this point about Sen and the capacity to be free. And the pain that people feel when they cannot actually find a way to live with the freedom that's in their heads and sometimes in their context, in their reality.
I would also like to give the word to Mr. Kakoma.
You ask a critical question on this time piece, and I think you reflect upon it very well. I'll give you a very practical example. The case of Rwanda has been referred to. If you stepped into Kigali today, you may think, wow, this is miraculous, given the circumstances, post-genocide society. It is miraculous if you think in historical, comparative terms about a society emerging out of chaos and destruction, but it's not miraculous if you look at the plans that have been executed over a decade. It's not by chance the level of infrastructure, the focus of education, the way in which regional networks have been forged, IT infrastructure has been established. It's not miraculous. It has been planned post-genocide for the last 20 years. By comparison, if you look at the destruction of the society in South Sudan, with all of the resources that one could imagine at its disposal in terms of capital, it has not been planned. And it continues to be in a state of turmoil, despite all of the resources at its disposal. And actually, this is the key point. The difference there is that one took for granted the fact that these resources would be there and didn't need investment and planning. The other, without vast capital, has to envision the future 20, 40, 50 years ahead and build a foundation and institutions in place. It's not perfect. It's far from. But that's the difference of the miraculous post-conflict story.
Okay, thank you so much. I'm afraid there will be no time. We could probably stay here a little bit longer, but our time is up. Just as a conclusion remark, I would like every one of you to say one sentence as a takeaway, like the most important key takeaway that you would like people to leave here with today.
Finland engaging in a collaborative process to bring futures literacy to the world. That's what I would think about.
Well, we have to use and integrate the results of the collective learning we do in futures literacy. Otherwise, it's good, but it's not in good use if we don't do so.
Our ability to imagine the future determines our present as much as our present determines our futures.
I think in as much as we've learned a lot about our past and can unshackle ourselves from our past, we can also free ourselves in the future. And that in part relies on unlearning things we learned, relearning things we need to learn, and knowing that we can know new things we didn't know we could actually know in the future. And that is the beauty of futures learning. Just in the same way we can learn a new language, we can learn the future differently. Thank you.
Confident Africa, EU's and Africa's gain.
We can all train our futures literacy.
Thank you so much. Thank you for your participation. Thank you.